Story 1. I was raised in a religious household but couldn't make it make sense. I guess I learned to value logic more than dogma. Story 2. At the age of 11, I experienced a psychological crisis when the inevitability of my own demise finally hit me. I had known for years that I would die someday, but the reality had never fully sunk in. At that time, I desperately wanted to believe anything that would allow me to avoid that fate. God, heaven, whatever. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't make myself believe any of it. Story 3. My mother convinced me that magic existed when I was 6 years old, until I realized it was not real in the sense that I could cast a spell. I also came to understand that Santa was false, and I concluded that anything magical was not true. To me, when I was 9 years old, God seemed no different than magic, and I believed it was just folklore for kids. I was surprised when someone got angry because I did not believe in God. At that moment, I thought they were joking since it was obvious that God was simply magic and did not exist. Yes, I stopped believing in God at 9 years old, and I assumed everyone thought the same way since believing in God seemed as ridiculous as believing that Santa existed. Story 4. I was 5 when I told my parents that there is no God because it made no sense. I am autistic. Prior to that, our family attended church regularly but eventually stopped taking me with them. As I grew older, I better understood why it made no sense. Story 5. When I read the Bible, some verses were misused by my church elders to pin their mistakes on me and make me apologize for them. The key was reading the book. It is the cure for the Christian religion. When you look at all the other texts that convey similar messages, just in favor of their superhuman deities, it feels like a clash among different comic book publishers. They all have fascinating heroes and characters within the same universe of their gods. Story 6. Combination of Sunday school and church being unable to answer my questions. Religious education in schools in Scotland taught us about the different religions worldwide. I also have an interest in mythology, which includes the ancient gods. Story 7. When I realized nearly all the rules within religions tend to provide real-world benefits to those at the top, while the ethereal benefits go to the masses, I saw a troubling pattern. It is a rather inexpensive scheme to maintain if you can attract a few believers. Just look at any cult. Story 8. When my uncle, who was amazing, died of a heart attack, the priest told us it was part of God's plan. I disagreed. Story 9. Raised Lutheran, I was in the final year of catechism when we reviewed the stories of Lot. I felt deeply offended, but I promised myself that I would complete catechism for my mother and never look back. That was 30 years ago, and every day has validated my choice. Story 10. I couldn't share this in my post because, as you know, this subreddit only allows questions. However, I want to state that I am an atheist. More than just rejecting the idea of God or gods, I completely reject and loathe religion. I have believed since I was very young that religion, in all its forms, is the origin of all evil in the world. When I was 8, my preschool class visited a nearby church, and the priest asked all the children if they were baptized. They all said yes, and the priest told them something like, "God is with you." Finally, the priest came up to me and asked if I was baptized. I answered no, which was the truth. What followed made me hate religion right then and there forever. The priest said to me, an 8-year-old child, "When you die, you will go to hell." Story 11. When I was 8 or 9, no one in Sunday school could explain dinosaurs to me or their conflict with the book of Genesis. I realized it was not true after that. Story 12. I was raised Catholic and had my first confession in 2nd grade, where I admitted that I did not believe in God. I have probably understood since I was able to grasp the concept that imaginary beings in the sky are often used by people to control others. Story 13. So what happened to Zeus, Apollo, and the rest of them? What did the Romans do? What about Set and all the fascinating gods from Egypt? How many gods are there in Hinduism? Are you telling me that the God of the Jews is the same as the God of Christians and Muslims, yet they are also different? And that Jesus is the same as all of them, but also the Son of God? How many holidays originated from previous popular religions? When you start to realize that religion is based on where you were born, rather than an absolute truth, you begin to question things. Education and critical thinking are valuable tools. For me, I was about 10 years old, learning about the ancient gods while watching Hercules and Xena, wondering why these deities were fictionalized while the ones in modern life were considered real. Story 14. I am a native of this land, and for thousands of years, our people lived in harmony with each other and the earth. It wasn't until religion was introduced that my people began to suffer. I understand the correlation between this and the hypocrisy surrounding it, which has shown me that the Fana religion is not the right path for my people or for me. Story 15. My parents were Christian but didn't push too hard on the church. I knew from a young age that it was all nonsense. Around the age of 13 or 14, I started reading the Bible and other writings, which confirmed my belief that it was all indeed nonsense. Story 16. I wasn't raised in a religious home, but I had religious friends and relatives, so I wasn't completely isolated from religion. I respect other people's beliefs. Story 17. In a very dark moment of my life, exactly the kind of moments where other people experience their religious awakening, I opened myself up to being helped by God and truly felt, as surely as religious people feel there is a God, that there was no God. At this point, it gives me comfort. What does life matter if it's all planned out already anyway? Story 18. I tried hard as a child to find Jesus. I went to several different churches with friends, read the Bible, and prayed a lot. It always felt like calling into a void. I didn't give up on the idea of the God many Christians believe in, the one who is all-loving, all-knowing, and all-powerful, until I was 18. I thought about how absurd it all is. The Bible says, God is love, but every Christian I know believes God can cure cancer. So why does cancer exist? Either God cannot cure it or God wants to keep it around. If God can cure cancer but chooses not to, God is essentially giving people cancer. When someone you love gets cancer, they go to a hospital where people apply medicine developed through millions of hours of work by thousands of individuals over many decades. The cancer goes into remission, and they thank God for that. God gave them cancer, or if you prefer, allowed them to get it. People sent it into remission, and they thank God. That's reminiscent of Stockholm Syndrome. Story 19. You can be raised in a religious environment and be told your entire life that God is good. You can appreciate the ethics of religion, the value of art, and the role faith has played in history or in your personal life. However, you can also examine history, even very recent events, and see how easily faith can be abused and used to commit atrocities. There are individuals who exploit the name of God and use sacred texts as shields against criticism, engaging in various forms of evil. When considering the actions of extremists, the ongoing wars, and the current trend of nationalism intertwined with religious texts in many places, it becomes clear that some individuals disregard the positive teachings of their faith, such as loving neighbors and treating others with empathy. Why should I feel compelled to be a part of that? I hold degrees in history and comparative religion and have studied religious texts deeply, similar to what a seminary student would do. It is disheartening to see so many people use faith to demean others. Though I was raised in a religious environment and had a positive experience in the church, I am aware that not everyone shares that experience, and I recognize the potential dangers. The way figures like Mussolini and Hitler manipulated religion serves as a reminder that no one should feel guilty for choosing not to believe. If a God exists with benevolent traits, how can those who represent such a being, acting immorally, be deemed moral? Furthermore, when contemplating the ultimate nature of existence, it can be described as what we apply the term God to, a nature with a distinct personality. However, when individuals declare others sinners or claim that natural disasters are divine punishment, or when they mistreat LGBTQ+ individuals, there is no justification for such actions. Religious individuals could benefit from practicing the humility they profess to value. 54% of people on this planet belong to one of the three major monotheistic Abrahamic faiths, yet they often act as if they are a minority facing oppression. They oppress one another and label others as wicked when they highlight this hypocrisy or folly. Story 20. I am in an interesting space. I am not necessarily an atheist. I am closer to agnosticism or deism. However, I am vehemently, almost militantly anti-religious. I cannot say for certain whether there is or is not a higher power of some kind, but even if there is, that higher power certainly does not have any demonstrable impact on our lives. Religion does have an effect, and it is, without a doubt, the most harmful institution ever created. It is a shame because it could be harnessed to do so much good, and at times it does, but it is much more frequently used to control people, abuse people, and oppress people. I dislike organized religion with every fiber of my being. Story 21. I followed the crowd as a child, but never really felt the spirit, no matter how much I prayed or tried. Then September 11th happened, and I saw a hateful side of people that ran so counter to what I had been taught that my skepticism increased again. Around the age of 11 to 12, I realized I could say no to going to church, and I never really looked back. I was firmly atheist for a long time, but now, as an adult, I realize it could be possible. I just don't have definitive proof. I don't see it as likely. So, I'm functionally atheist, but from a label standpoint, I am really agnostic. Story 22. I don't know. Religion was never really a part of my life. My family was not religious. My father's family is extremely religious, but he was the black sheep of the family. My parents separated when I was 3, and my dad fit the stereotype of a weekend father. Therefore, I was never close with my extended family on his side and always thought they were strange. Religion played a role in that, but it wasn't everything. Story 23. I mean, it really depends on what your definition of God is. Some people say God is everything that exists. In that case, I am not an atheist at all. On the other hand, if your definition implies that religions such as Islam or Mormonism represent an infallible system of thought, then the answer is just as obvious. It is clearly man-made, and there is no reason to believe that. In other words, I am agnostic, not atheist. The same concept applies to politics. Left and right need clear definitions that we can all agree on. All discussions are meaningless until that is sorted out. Story 24. When I was a child, my parents gave me a Bible, a Quran, and some other literature to read so I could decide if I believed any of it. My parents were raised Catholic but did not believe themselves, so they were also atheists or at least did not follow any particular book. I read them all, or at least parts of them, and concluded that I did not believe in any of it. Dead is dead. Much later, I discovered that this was called being an atheist. I must have been about 13 years old at the time. Story 25. When raised in a non-religious family, there is no significant moment of realization. Not believing is simply the default, and I have yet to experience anything that convinced me otherwise. Story 26. I grew up watching Star Trek. This encouraged me to respect science, but also led me to believe that humanity was on an upward trajectory. Many deities have appeared in Star Trek, and each one is revealed to be a powerful alien with a giant ego. I want to hold Christian values, and I would like to believe in a deity. Theists tell me to pray, and I have done so many times. I have never felt anything in response. Even at my most sincere, I have never felt anything at all. Story 27. I was raised Catholic and attended church every Sunday. We received these homilies in consecutive weeks when I was about 13. 1. Being gay is an abomination. Sodomites will burn in hell. Only a few priests molested children, and they had a small moment of weakness. They should be forgiven for their sins. My cousin came out as a lesbian, and the church quietly chastised her. To my family's credit, every single member left that church because of it. Some relatives found new, more inclusive churches, but I never returned. Story 28. In my early 20s, I had a near-death experience, and I didn't pray for help. I was raised in a strict Jehovah's Witness family, so it should have been second nature. That's when I realized that I didn't actually believe any of it. Story 29. When teachers of religion dismiss reasonable questions such as what proof exists of God, whether the Bible should be taken literally, and if not, how to discern what to take literally and what not to, it raises concerns. Story 30. I remember standing at the back of a Catholic church and just thinking it made no sense. It took me another 8 years and confirmation to escape. Confirmation felt like a turning point. I was suddenly considered an adult in the church, responsible for my own religious journey. I have not attended a Sunday service since. Story 31. The moment I was old enough to develop basic critical thinking, around 4 or 5 years old, I noticed that none of my parents or anyone in my extended family practiced religion. Story 32. I realized that an all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-loving God would not afflict suffering on those they love for a test. If he is all-knowing, he already knows the outcome, and if he is all-loving, he would not cause such suffering. If he is unable to stop the suffering, then he is not all-powerful. Therefore, the argument collapses under scrutiny. Story 33. At 10 years old, I realized and could prove that the Baptist church I grew up in was primarily focused on acquiring money. Story 34. It never made sense to me. It is a well-written piece of fiction or the oldest scam in the world. However, I may have fully realized its implications when the priest who married us was defrocked and incarcerated for abusing children. Story 35. When I was 15, I had to confess to a man I didn't know that I had been intimate once or twice with a boyfriend. I haven't been religious since then, and I am now 84. Story 36. I didn't think much about it for most of my life, but my mom and I were watching a historical movie. The romantic pairing was executed, and then two doves took to the skies, implying that their pure and sweet lives would bring them together in heaven. I paused and reflected on why that notion was not at all satisfying to me. That's when I realized I did not believe in heaven. Story 37. I was raised Catholic and attended Catholic school as a child. Like many others have mentioned, the stories and teachings just didn't make sense to me. My belief in God faded around the same time I stopped believing in Santa. I am still amazed that adults choose to go to church. Story 38. I grew up in a non-religious household, so the many stories I hear don't make sense to me. The one that really stands out is the Ark story. How did animals from North and South America get on the Ark? That is a significant ocean to swim across to reach where the Ark was. Sloths would have been at a disadvantage, right? How did they feed all those different animals? Elephants alone eat between 400 and 660 pounds of food a day. After the whole event, wouldn't that mean that every animal would be incredibly inbred? Again, I am not religious and have never read the Bible, so I could be missing many points that I'm not aware of. But that story is just remarkable when you think about it. Story 39. I have always known that everyone starts off as an atheist. It is just a matter of whether you believe people when they tell you their God exists. Nobody made a compelling argument beyond simply asking for trust. Combine that with the knowledge that there have been thousands of other religions that have come and gone, and it became obvious to me that it was all man-made fiction. I see no reason to believe in modern-day Christianity, Judaism, Islam, or any other religions more than I should believe in ancient Greek, Roman, Egyptian, Mayan, or Incan gods. Story 40. Have any of you ever been told to ignore the messenger, embrace the message, or something similar? This usually happens when the messenger is considered suspect or is facing scrutiny for their actions. I realized at 15 years old that if this message is not important to the messenger and cannot change them, why should I believe it has any power? Story 41. The religion teacher in grade 2 told me that all the starving babies in Africa, during the 1990s when those commercials were constantly aired between cartoons, were going to hell if they had not accepted Jesus into their hearts. Story 42. I was raised by religious parents who used abuse and fear to maintain control. Eventually, I realized that religion is somewhat similar to Santa Claus, a way to control people from doing bad things through fear. Story 43. I worked in emergency medicine for about 20 years. There is no way you could ever convince me that there is a God. Story 44. When I was 7, my mother made me attend religious education for the Catholic Church, and I have proudly disavowed Christianity and any other religion since that time. Story 45. When I was young, I thought that only elderly people were religious because how could any educated person from a modern technological society believe such fantastical stories? Jesus walking on water and healing the sick seems just as unbelievable as Santa delivering presents to everyone in one night. I don't know how old I was when I learned about the concept of atheism and the terminology to describe a lack of belief. Story 46. I read the Bible and noticed quickly that religion is not about faith, but rather inventing rules to maintain power. Story 47. I struggled with every aspect of religion as a child. It never made sense to me. For a long time, I thought I was just not intelligent enough and needed to learn more. By high school, I was attending church twice a week and became a challenge for my Bible study teachers. I had many questions they couldn't answer. By college, I realized I just didn't believe any of it. I genuinely believe it was written as a tool for controlling the masses. Story 48. When I realized that the prospect of rejoining the earth after I die brought me more peace than the prospect of going to heaven. Story 49. I'm not exactly sure, but it was about a quarter of the way through my mom taking me to every denomination of church in our area. No matter what they were saying, I wasn't convinced. Story 50. I am autistic. As such, emotional reasoning was hard for me to process as a child. The people at church seemed to be speaking a different language. Their statements were all based on emotion and wishful thinking. As a child, I figured I must be wrong and just wasn't paying attention, so I asked questions. Lots of questions. They didn't like that. My mother was asked not to bring me back because faith wasn't a valid reason in my mind. It was an absurd answer, and that's where the conversation always went. At the age of 9, I was pretty sure something was fundamentally wrong with those people. I looked into other religions because, again, I was a kid. Clearly, all these people must have been onto something, and I just wasn't getting it. It was frustrating, depressing, even. Every single group presented the same conclusion. Faith was the answer. They all reached the same conclusion yet arrived at incredibly different beliefs. The initial response boiled down to, because I want to believe it. And that's when I realized what was happening. From there, I became more interested in behavioral sciences, seeking to understand why people wanted to believe those things and why they wanted to convince others. I went on to earn degrees in behavioral sciences and sociology, focusing on the religious influence on society. I would say that at around the age of 11, I was accused of being an atheist, which taught me what that meant. I realized that yes, I was one. Story 51. Humans invented language and the scientific method, discovered bacteria and antibiotics, and identified viruses. Why didn't the omnipotent being teach us these things? Because we invented him too. Story 52. I had been experiencing significant issues with religion since I was 14. It gradually fell apart for me until I finally realized this at 17. Story 53. Raised in a household without religious beliefs. My father made an effort to answer all questions in an open-minded manner. He would explain the different perspectives. Some people believe one thing, others believe something else, and I have my own beliefs. Ultimately, there is no definitive way to know who is right, as everyone thinks they possess the truth. It's essential to go with the flow. I believe that rationality and honesty led me to trust people rather than accepting what some authoritative figure says about a higher power. This perspective also helped me develop empathy by avoiding absolutes, remaining open to the possibility of being wrong, and accepting that it is okay to do so. I miss you, Dad. Story 54. The argument of theodicy, or the paradox of the three-legged stool. God must be omnipotent, omniscient, and all good to be considered God and be worthy of worship. However, a God that possesses all these attributes cannot allow evil to exist, yet evil does exist. Story 55. When I applied the same skepticism to my own religion that I directed at others, I concluded that there is some sort of first mover, but I do not believe there is a man in the sky keeping a tally. Story 56. Around the same time, I realized that if Santa Claus was a lie, then all the religious beliefs that didn't make sense were also a lie. It was such a relief to my young mind. Story 57. My family was religious, but not extremely religious. The most devout person in my family was my grandmother. I thought the stories were a bit far-fetched and didn't completely make sense, but if Grandma believed so strongly, it must be true. When I was 10, she passed away from ovarian cancer at the age of 50. I remember thinking there is no God. If there were a God, why would he allow all this suffering? Why would this kind woman, who devoted so much of her life to him, be allowed to suffer so much at such a young age and not even live through it to see a brighter side? I've heard all the reasons people offer, and I just never accepted them. Story 58. I was always an atheist. I believed that the idea of a god was the most foolish concept I had ever encountered. No amount of beatings, and there were quite a few, persuaded me otherwise. Story 59. In my early 20s, I realized that groups of people tend to be uninformed, which led me to dismiss everything related to religion. However, this year I began exploring spirituality. I no longer consider myself an atheist, but I still reject organized religion, especially those centered around the Abrahamic concept of God. Story 60. I never saw any difference between believing and not believing. Literally, nothing changes. Except you have more time to do and think about whatever you want, while respecting the law. Story 61. I studied the Bible and attended a seminar. I uncovered the lies, deception, and death associated with the church, and then I left. Story 62. There was an inclination in elementary school when I attended catechism while learning about evolution. This feeling grew stronger over the years. Story 63. 9 years old, sitting in a Presbyterian church, drawing demons on the handouts, listening to the preacher and thinking this is complete nonsense. None of this makes any sense. Story 64. When I was a child, I noticed the two-faced actions of churchgoers. The stories always seemed suspicious to me. I have always had the inclination to resist peer pressure, which was often strong at the various churches I attended. Story 65. As a child, I would go to church with my grandmother each year on Christmas Eve. One year, the priest mentioned that a light will appear and guide you. And when Jesus was born, people exclaimed, "That's it, that's the light." Couldn't believe it. I must have been 9 or 10, but that was when everything changed for me. It was as if the scales had fallen from my eyes, and I realized that everything they were saying seemed so foolish. Story 66. When I started to question whether my standards of critical thinking and evidence made sense in reaching the conclusion about accepting the claim that a deity exists, I had already unsubscribed from the religion I was a part of, Christianity. Story 67. When I hit a low point in my life, I had been questioning my faith for a long time and was deconstructing it. My dad was diagnosed with a terminal illness. I didn't immediately turn to God as I might have expected. Instead, I focused on the present, thinking about how to help him, how to treat it, how to slow down the progression, and how to cherish our time together. That's when I realized I was an atheist. God had no impact on how I coped with such a difficult situation. Prayer never entered my mind, and I later recognized that I didn't even give God a second thought. That's how I knew. Story 68. That's such a strange question. Is the standard the default? No one has ever managed to convince me otherwise. Story 69. Religion is a significant business. I bet there are more Catholic churches in your town than fast food restaurants. Count them. Story 70. I struggled with depression about a year ago, and all I could think about was my death. This made me realize that life felt meaningless, and I didn't believe anyone was watching over me. I felt completely alone. Since then, I have lost my faith. Story 71. At around 25, it took me another decade to express my thoughts. Raised in the Southern Bible Belt with family in Episcopal, Baptist, Pentecostal, and non-denominational communities, they all spoke so differently about their expectations of God. Their scriptures were filled with stories that seemed cruel and nonsensical, like Noah and the ark, talking bushes and seas parting. God created everything in 7 days and then felt lonely. Moreover, there were older married men hitting on me when I was a teenager. And there are 4,000 religions? It's all absurd. Story 72. Honestly, I don't know if I ever really believed. As a kid, I thought it was basically a game everyone played. Story 73. You will notice how the church changes the rules based on what the population will accept. That is why the changes you mentioned occurred. If any of this were the teaching of a deity, it would not be fluid, according to my interpretation. It makes more sense to me that we are witnessing the results of ancient cults with generations of indoctrination. This is something we observe throughout history in all societies, rather than an infallible and all-powerful being setting limitations based on the genitals of the creatures created by that being. I do not want to delve too deeply, so I will conclude my thoughts here. Story 74. Raised in a not very strict Catholic household by a zookeeper and a horticulturist. I knew the moment they tried to explain the Ark to me that it was all nonsense. Story 75. My dad was Lutheran, and my mother was some Christian variation, both non-practicing. If I had to describe their beliefs, that's what I would say. There was no church on Sundays or holidays growing up. My dad believed introducing children to something they cannot fully comprehend was indoctrination, and he wanted no part in it. However, I was still expected to respect my mom and avoid using phrases like, "damn it," or "Jesus Christ," as she considered them inappropriate. I kind of knew from an early age. It didn't stop me from praying occasionally during significant moments in my life. I prayed in my head, hoping that if it was real, I would change and that things would improve. Each time, when the negative event occurred and my prayer went unanswered, it reinforced the belief I had held since childhood. Nowadays, I don't claim to know anything beyond what I believe, and that frightens me. It feels like being cut off from everything. My thoughts, my experiences. I imagine it must feel like falling asleep or passing out at first. The brain floods with chemicals. Who knows what happens afterward? Some people claim to see lights, angels, or loved ones, while others experience nothing at all. Hallucinations are a well-established phenomenon, so I assume that experiencing nothing is the most likely outcome if it even warrants any expectation. Story 76. Ricky Gervais made a point on a show once that I have said for years. If you destroy all the Bibles and all the scientific books in the world, 1,000 years later the scientific books would come back and be the same except for new discoveries. Religious books would not. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.